It's 4:12 a.m. outside a strip mall shoe store, and you've been in line since midnight with 11 other people who are not your friends. All of you refreshing the same resale app on your phones, watching the same number tick upward in real time. The shoes releasing in 6 hours retail for 220s. 3 states over, a pair from last month's drop is already listed for 340s. You're not here because you love sneakers. You're here because you did the math. This is the smallest, least glamorous rung of a ladder that, if you climb it all the way, ends with someone buying and selling entire companies for 8 figures. Almost nobody sees the ladder as one continuous thing because the person flipping shoes at 4 a.m. and the person flipping businesses at 40 look like they're doing nothing alike. They're doing exactly the same thing at wildly different scale. Buy low, hold briefly, sell for more than you paid, and repeat it enough times that the spread compounds into something real. At this level, the math is almost insultingly small. You buy a pair for 220s listed on a resale platform, and if it sells for 350, the platform takes its cut first. Most resale marketplaces charge somewhere around 10% of the sale price, which leaves you with roughly $350 against your $220 cost. Call it $95 profit if nothing goes wrong. Beginners doing this consistently, 5 to 15 pairs a month, tend to clear somewhere between $300 and $1,500 in a given month. It is not nothing. It is also, by 2025, a much worse bet than it used to be. Margins on resold sneakers have compressed hard, from close to 100% a few years ago, down to something closer to 10 to 25% per pair now. And market data suggests fewer than half of new releases even trade above retail anymore. You don't know any of this the first time you do it. You just know you bought something for 220s and sold it 9 days later for $95 more than you paid. And that feeling, small, specific, undeniably real, is the exact same feeling that shows up at every single level above this one, just with more zeros attached. 2 years and maybe 40 pairs of shoes later, you've saved enough that the $220 line item stops feeling like a real ceiling, and you start looking at something with a bigger spread and a slower clock. Cars. You buy your first one at a dealer auction, a decent sedan with 80,000 miles, for a price that felt aggressive when you bid it and reasonable the moment the gavel dropped. The auction house takes its cut before you even drive it off the lot. Buyer fees at these auctions commonly run around 20% of the hammer price, and that's before you've paid transport, a light reconditioning, or the sales tax you'll eat when you title it. You sell it 5 weeks later for $20,100 more than everything you put into it. That's actually a good outcome. Independent flippers doing this regularly tend to land somewhere between $1,000 and $3,000 of profit per car. And the honest current number, the one nobody selling a car flipping course wants to lead with, is that the average gross profit per used vehicle has actually been falling, down to around $1,306 as of the most recent full-year comparison, a drop of roughly 9% from the year before. As more people figured out the same arbitrage you just did, you learn the real lesson here isn't the profit per car, it's the speed. A car that clears $2,000 in 20 days beats a car that clears $3,000 in 120 days. Because the 20-day car lets you put that same capital back to work 6 times in the time the slow car ties it up once. One dealer you meet at the auction, running this at real scale, moves 30 cars a month at roughly $3,000 profit each, not because any single deal is spectacular, but because the capital never sits still. You start timing your own holds the same way, and for the first time, you're not just flipping an asset, you're managing a cycle. The cars teach you something that changes how you see the next level entirely. You don't actually need to own the asset to profit from the spread. You just need to control it, briefly, and pass that control to someone willing to pay more for it than you agreed to pay. That's the entire mechanic behind real estate wholesaling, and it's the first level where you stop touching inventory at all. You find a distressed property, a house whose owner needs out fast more than they need top dollar, and you put it under contract at a price that leaves room underneath it. You never buy the house. You assign the contract to a cash buyer, usually a flipper or landlord who wants the deal but doesn't want to find it themselves, for a fee that sits on top of your contract price. The nationwide average for that assignment fee runs around $13,000, though the range is wide. A typical wholesaler nets somewhere between $3,000 and $7,000 per deal starting out, while experienced operators in competitive markets routinely clear $15,000 to $20,000, and in the hottest metros, $30,000 or more on a single contract. The number moves a lot by geography. Wholesalers in North Carolina and Georgia average around $22,000 per assignment. In Arizona, the average is closer to $5,000. You learn this the slow way, by working a market that turned out to be softer than you assumed, and it recalibrates something in you. The spread was never just about the deal. It's about which market you're standing in when you find it. What strikes you most doing your first few assignments is how little capital actually moves through your hands. No inventory, no holding costs, no 20% auction fee eating your margin before you've even started. Just a signature, a network of buyers you've built one deal at a time, and a fee that shows up when the paperwork clears. It's the same spread you chased in the shoe line at 4 a.m. It just doesn't require you to ever touch the product. Wholesaling teaches you to see spreads. It doesn't teach you to build them because you're never actually improving the asset. You're just moving paper faster than the next person. The next level is where you stop being the messenger and start being the reason the house is worth more than you paid for it. You buy your first flip outright, a house that needs real work, not cosmetic touch-ups, a kitchen gutted to the studs, bathrooms redone, a roof patched before winter. You put your own capital at risk for the first time in a way that actually keeps you up at night, because unlike the wholesale deal, there's no assigning your way out if the market shifts before you're done. 6 months later, after contractors, permits, carrying costs, and a sale that took 2 weeks longer than you budgeted for, you clear a profit that lands close to the national number. The median flip profit across the country, according to the most recent full-year data, sits around $28,000. The gross number looks better before reality catches up with it. Average gross profit margins on flips, the simple difference between purchase price and resale price, before you subtract a single dollar of renovation, holding costs, or fees, run closer to $73 to $500. That gap between the gross number and the number that actually lands in your account is the real lesson of this level. Every level up the ladder, the space between what a deal looks like on paper and what it pays out after costs gets wider, not narrower. And the people who survive here are the ones who price that gap in before they ever made an offer. You start keeping a spreadsheet you didn't need at the sneaker level or even the car level. Line items for permits, contractor overruns, and the 6 weeks a house sat on the market longer than you'd modeled. The spread is bigger here than anything you've touched before. So is everything standing between you and actually keeping it. The gap between what a deal looks like on paper and what actually survives contact with reality doesn't close as you go up the ladder. It gets sharper, and so does the number attached to getting it wrong. At this level, you're not flipping a product or a contract or even a single asset. You're buying an entire operating business with employees, customers, and a P&L that either supports the price you paid or doesn't. This is roughly where entrepreneurship through acquisition lives. The world of people who raise capital specifically to buy one small company, run it, and eventually sell it. Typical deals here run $500,000 to $2 million in purchase price, financed with a mix of personal equity, investor equity, a seller note, and senior bank debt. Often less than 20% of the purchase price actually comes from the buyer's own pocket. The acquisition price itself usually lands around 3 to 5 times the business's annual cash flow. Call it 4x on average, which means a business generating $300,000 a year in profit might sell for something in the neighborhood of $1.2 million. If you've made it this far into how each level actually works, this is exactly the kind of channel built for you. A subscribe genuinely helps more people find it. No pressure, but I'd appreciate it. The honest numbers here cut both ways. According to the most comprehensive study of this world, out of Stanford's Graduate School of Business, 57% of people who set out to search for a company to buy actually complete an acquisition. Of those who do, the aggregate return has historically landed around a 32.9 to 35.1% internal rate of return. Genuinely exceptional performance, on par with or ahead of most private equity and venture returns. Operators who buy well and exit in 5 to 7 years can personally clear $3 million to $10 million. But 32% of people who start a search never close a deal at all. And for them, the return is zero, full stop, after years of unpaid effort. Somewhere past your second or third small acquisition, you stop being the only capital in the room. Institutional buyers start showing up to the same deals you're chasing. Private equity firms, backed by pension funds and endowments, looking at companies bigger than anything you personally financed with a seller note and a bank loan. You watch how they operate, and eventually you're operating alongside them on deals in the $10 million to $500 million range instead of the $500,000 to $2 million range you started in. The multiples move with the size. Across that middle market band, the average purchase price in 2025 runs around 7.2 to 7.5 times a company's annual cash flow, up from 7.0x the year before. But the number isn't flat across the board. Deals between $100 million and $250 million command closer to 10 times cash flow, nearly double what you'd pay for something under $10 million, where multiples sit closer to 5.5x. The same business, the exact same profit margin, is worth a meaningfully different multiple purely because of the size of the check being written for it. The other number that's shifted, and that nobody selling the private equity dream leads with, is leverage. The average debt used to finance these buyouts has come down hard, from roughly 6.2 times cash flow in 2024 to 3.4 times in 2025. Lenders are simply less willing to fund deals the way they used to. That shift alone has pulled buyout returns down with it. A deal structured today generates something closer to a 10.8% sponsor return versus 13.1% under a comparable 2019 structure, with most of that gap explained by tighter lending rather than higher prices. Historically, across 2 decades, private equity buyout funds have averaged around 13.7% net annual returns. Genuinely strong, but a long way from the eye-popping multiples people assume when they hear private equity. You realize, standing in a room negotiating a deal 10,000 times the size of your first sneaker flip, that the mechanics never actually changed. Buy for less than it's worth. Improve it, or just wait, or both. Sell it for more. The number attached to more is the only thing that ever got bigger. You still remember the exact profit on that first pair of shoes, $95 on a Tuesday, standing in a parking lot at sunrise, with a clarity you don't have for most of the numbers that came after it. Somewhere around the car flipping years, the figures start blurring into each other, one auction bid indistinguishable from the next, until wholesaling forced you to think in fees instead of margins, and flipping houses forced you to think in months instead of days. What you actually remember, more than any single number, is the moment each level stopped feeling like a system you understood. The sneaker line was simple. You could see the entire spread with your own eyes before you ever paid for anything. By the time you're negotiating a leveraged buyout, you're trusting a capital structure built by people you've never met, financed by lenders reacting to macroeconomic conditions you don't control, on a multiple that moved 2 full turns higher just because the deal crossed an arbitrary size threshold. You think sometimes about the 11 strangers in that shoe line with you at 4 a.m. years ago now. You don't know if any of them kept going. Statistically, most people who start at that level never go past it. The margins compress, the effort to reward ratio stops making sense, and they move on to something else entirely. You were the one who kept finding the next level up, not because you were smarter than the people who stopped, but because you kept discovering that the exact same instinct that worked on a $220 pair of shoes also worked, with different vocabulary and different stakes, on a $220 million company. The thing nobody tells you at the beginning is that the ladder doesn't end. There's always a bigger spread, a bigger multiple, a bigger version of the same trade, one level further than wherever you currently stand. The only real choice you make at every single level is whether the spread left over is still worth what it costs you to reach it. If you're the kind of person who made it through every level of this, sneakers, cars, contracts, houses, companies, and then companies bigger than the ones before them, you've probably already started asking the next question. Once you're the one buying and selling assets at this scale, what do you actually hold everything in? Nobody serious about this game keeps a $40 million company in their own name, exposed to their own personal liability, taxed the same way as a paycheck. That's a different video entirely. The one about how people structure what they've built once the deals get big enough to need real protection instead of just a good spreadsheet. Watch our episode on the anonymous LLC empire. It picks up almost exactly where the top of this ladder leaves off.